Hi, Tall Toast here. Today I'll be recapping the sci-fi thriller Spiderhead. Settle in and subtitles on. Embark on a journey to Spiderhead, a cutting-edge prison located on a breathtaking tropical island. A select group of inmates have been handpicked for a unique opportunity to live a life of comfort, complete with personal quarters, assigned tasks, and multiple leisure activities. In return, they've agreed to participate in experiments exploring the effects of chemicals that can manipulate emotions. Equipped with a compact Moby pack containing these powerful substances, the prisoners must give their consent with a simple "acknowledge" before being administered a new dose. At the helm of all experiments, the brilliant Steve Abnesti and his trusty sidekick Mark oversee the proceedings. Today they administered a dose of the powerful G46 to Ray, causing him to burst into uncontrolled laughter as Steve recited a series of absurd jokes. Despite Mark's attempts to bring the mood down by reciting bleak historical facts, the effects of the G46 kept Ray in a state of hysteria. With a nod of approval, Steve jotted down notes and affixed a golden star sticker to his notebook. The next day, prisoner Jeff was taken by surprise as he was led out of the building blindfolded for a special trial. Upon administering a dose of N40 and removing his blindfold, Jeff's surroundings were transformed into a breathtaking, awe-inspiring spectacle. Struggling to put his newfound beauty into words, Jeff was then given a dose of B15, resulting in an outpouring of articulate expression. With the power of B15 coursing through his veins, Jeff paints a vivid picture of the stunning surroundings. But the reality is far from the poetic depiction. In actuality, Jeff has been viewing a contaminated wasteland. Upon his return to the penitentiary, Jeff joins forces with Lizzie, a fellow inmate and object of his affection, in their shared duty of whipping up snacks. This allows them to connect, bond, and swap stories about their experiences with the tests. As the day comes to a close, Jeff retires to his room where he indulges in his passion for drawing intricate works of art on his Etch-a-Sketch. Though it brings him solace, it also invites reminders of the tragedy that landed him in prison. One fateful night, at a party with close friends Adam and Emma, Jeff succumbs to overindulgence and, in a drunken state, gets behind the wheel of a car alongside Adam. Tragically, his impaired driving results in a crash that takes Adam's life. For the next experiment, Jeff is paired with the lovely Heather, a fellow inmate. To ensure that their previous interactions were limited, Steve double-checks before inquiring about their mutual attraction. To his surprise, their interest in each other was only moderate. However, after receiving a dose of the potent N40, Jeff and Heather are struck by an intense, irresistible physical attraction to each other. In a moment of passion, they surrender to their feelings right in front of the cameras and researchers. As they bask in the afterglow, the couple cuddles and even professes their love for each other. Ecstatic about the successful effects of N40, Steve and Mark revel in their triumph. However, Steve is cautious in his celebration and withholds his signature gold star until he could assess the after effects. Later, when Jeff makes the rounds serving food, he approaches Heather, leading to an awkward encounter between the two. Despite the lack of any lingering romantic feelings, Steve repeats the N40 experiment, pairing Jeff with Sarah, an older prisoner that holds no appeal to Jeff. However, after receiving a double dose of N40, Jeff finds himself unable to resist his urges. As Mark refills Jeff's Moby pack, he warns him to be mindful during his amorous encounters, as the delicate box is prone to breaking with even the slightest impact, risking the loss of control. Taking advantage of the moment, Jeff requests a change of chores, citing a need for a change, but with a hidden motive. The following day, Jeff is taken aback when he finds himself at the scientist's desk with Steve and Mark for their next experiment. There are 2 rooms in play, and in one, Dave is devouring huge portions of food, taking only brief breaks to vomit. Meanwhile, Jeff discovers Heather and Sarah in the other room. Steve proposes a straightforward challenge for Jeff. He must pick one of the two and administer Darkenflox, a substance Steve describes as a harmless agitator. Jeff is uneasy with the task and declines to choose, explaining that if he had to, it would be purely by chance, as he has no particular fondness for either of them. He refuses simply because he had been subjected to the chemical before and vividly recalls how unpleasant the experience was. Steve finds Jeff's reactions intriguing, as he has undergone varying doses, yet the outcome remains unchanged. Later on, Lizzie tries to approach Jeff to inquire about his change in chores. However, their conversation is abruptly cut short by the guards who remind Jeff that today is his designated day off. He is permitted to leave the facility for a walk and to call Emma, but as usual he is sent straight to her voicemail. Jeff leaves a message apologizing and expressing how much he misses her, like he always does. But this time, he also mentions Lizzie. For their next experiment, Jeff is paired up with Rogan. Jeff is worried that he may be forced to engage with Rogan, and therefore refuses to accept any dose. To his relief, nothing occurs, and they are allowed to leave after a brief wait. Putting two and two together, Jeff rushes to the scientist's room to confirm his fears. Heather had been tasked with administering Darkenflox to either Jeff or Rogan, but she chose neither. Enraged, Jeff demands to know if everyone is involved with each other, and Steve presents him with a chart displaying the connections among the prisoners. Steve explains that it's part of the experimental design mandated by the Protocol Committee, a design he personally dislikes. When Jeff voices his discomfort with the unethical boundaries being crossed in these tests, Steve reminds him that he was the one who volunteered, and the alternative was life in a grueling state jail surrounded by corrupt cops. Fearing the loss of his privileges, Jeff apologizes and returns for another test with Rogan. Thankfully, Sarah also chooses not to administer Darkenflox to either of them. After the experiment, Steve thinks they're close to giving it a glowing recommendation, but Mark is beginning to feel uneasy as well. Steve reassures him that this is important work to make the world a better place. Later, Steve decides to treat himself to a dose of N40, something the prisoners are unaware of, as he also carries a Moby pack. As Jeff and Lizzie share dinner, Jeff describes the horrible effects of Darkenflox. Lizzie holds his hand and inquires why he changed chores. Jeff tells her that this place messes with his mind, and he often forgets who he was before arriving, but when he's with her, he feels truly like himself. On Monday, Steve decides to take a chance and asks Mark to administer a triple dose of the chemicals to him. Jeff arrives for the day's experiment and catches them in the act, but the scientists quickly hide everything, so Jeff chooses not to comment. For the upcoming experiment, Steve informs Jeff that they must continue the Darkenflox testing per committee orders. Jeff is unsure about administering the dose to Heather, but Steve urges him to proceed, reminding Jeff of Heather's past misdeeds and the fact that he was chosen for this task instead of Rogan. Jeff pleads with Steve to petition the committee, but Steve leaves the room, claiming to make the call while actually grabbing coffee and chatting with Lizzie. When Steve returns, he falsely tells Jeff that the committee won't change their minds, and Jeff must complete the experiment or face expulsion. Reluctantly, Jeff gives Heather Darkenflox, causing her immense pain. Later, Mark also gives Jeff B15 to enhance Jeff's ability to describe Heather's panic, guilt, and lack of affection. In the heat of the moment, Heather's wild thrashing causes her to hit the wall and break her Moby pack, causing a flood of Darkenflox to pour into her. Her reaction becomes incredibly violent, leading her to shatter a vase and use the fragments to take her own life before Mark can intervene. Both Steve and Mark race to her side, with Steve dropping his keys in the commotion. While they argue, Jeff sees an opportunity to investigate, snagging Steve's keys and using them to gain access to his notebook. He finds a formula for OBDX with the Abnesti Pharmaceuticals logo at the top. Jeff uncovers a bingo card filled with gold stars. N40 is the only one without a star, as it hasn't achieved the goal of true love yet. As Jeff delves deeper, he catches sight of Steve's return and swiftly conceals the evidence, tossing the keys back to the floor. Later, Mark presses Steve to report the incident, but Steve declines. He knows reporting it would lead to their downfall, and they've already strayed too far to turn back now. Steve then visits Jeff, trying to comfort him with a well-crafted speech, but it falls short. Instead, he tries a different approach and shares the results of the chemical test on Ray. This leads to a burst of uncontrollable laughter, even when Steve reveals a poignant part of his past. His father abandoned him in childhood. Jeff ponders why Steve never leaves the facility like Mark does, and Steve answers simply, this project is his one true love. Lizzie, the next subject for the experiment, is given a chemical that induces intense phobia, and she's paralyzed by fear at the sight of everyday objects like a stapler. Afterwards, she confides in Jeff about her trauma and shame. He sympathizes with her, admitting the real reason he requested a change in duties was because of his own shame. Lizzie is puzzled by their constant compliance for petty luxuries, and Jeff shares his story of a fateful night, when his drunk driving led to the death of both Adam and Emma, leaving him consumed by guilt ever since. Jeff and Lizzie share a comforting embrace and finally kiss. Later, Jeff sees them having a snack in the kitchen and begins to form a plan. Upon reviewing the security footage and discovering Jeff has been sketching Lizzie, Steve confirms his suspicion and retires for the night after taking another dose of N40. The following day, Steve invites Jeff for another experiment, to administer Darkenflox to Lizzie. Jeff declines, and Steve allows him to leave unscathed. As soon as Jeff exits, Steve instructs Mark to double his dose of B6. Upon Mark's arrival, Jeff challenges him with the truth that he knows there's no committee, and B6 isn't a harmless placebo, but rather the sole chemical Steve is invested in. Mark reveals that he once wanted to work with a brilliant mind and bring about change to the world, but now he has second thoughts. Jeff spots this and, together, they hatch a plan before Mark departs for the weekend. The following Monday, it's only Steve and Jeff in the testing room because Mark is sick at home. Jeff is given control to dose Lizzie with Darkenflox, but he still refuses to do it, which makes Steve furious. Unable to understand how these two could love each other after a few months locked inside a facility, Steve tries to change Jeff's mind by ordering Lizzie to confess her crime. She forgot her daughter in her car, and the baby died. Lizzie breaks down in tears, asking Jeff for the chemicals, and Jeff presses the screen of the control. However, Steve breaks into laughter. Mark played a trick and altered the programming so that Jeff would dose Steve with the chemicals. Mark also added extra doses of B6 in Steve's Moby pack. Jeff first exposes Steve to the fear chemical and then gives him Darkenflox. As Steve writhes in agony, Jeff reveals to him that Mark is on his way with the police and that Jeff knows the true purpose of the experiment. B6 is a mind control chemical designed to make people do as you wish. The name Obediex is a play on obedience. Despite his pain, Steve thinks B6 could be used for good causes. The only reason testing hasn't been completed is because obedience hasn't been 100% yet, meaning the subject's deep emotions are still able to resist. Steve also confesses that Jeff and Lizzie had completed their sentences days earlier and never informed them. Infuriated, Jeff pushes Steve's head onto the table and forces him to use his fingerprint on the control panel to unlock the front door so Jeff can escape and tell the world about Heather's death. On his way out, Jeff notices Steve reaching for a knife and demands that he hand it over. However, Steve is able to ignore that direct order even while on the effects of the extra B6 dose. The chemical isn't strong enough to overpower real feelings, and like Steve told Jeff the other day, this project is his one true love, so he'll defend it with his life. Steve hits Jeff and steals the control to give Lizzie 4 doses of Darkenflox, which immediately makes her go crazy. Jeff attacks Steve, making him drop and break the control in the ensuing fight, but by pushing him against the wall, he also breaks Steve's Moby pack. The sudden rush of chemicals weakens Steve, giving Jeff the chance to push him away, steal the keys and run to check on Lizzie. Jeff jumps into action and revives Lizzie's breathing. He then opens her Moby pack and empties out all the chemical bottles. Lizzie feels guilty for not admitting her wrongdoings earlier, but Jeff comforts her and reminds her of his unwavering love. The two of them gear up for their escape plan. Steve sounds the alarm. He warns the other inmates that if they don't put a stop to Jeff and Lizzie's plan, they'll lose all their perks. Just then, Steve spots the police closing in on the facility through the security cameras. He quickly snatches as many chemical vials as he can carry and makes a run for it. As Jeff and Lizzie make their exit, they unite to fend off Sarah and Ray. Dave attempts to intervene, but Lizzie swiftly sidesteps any conflict by handing him the pantry keys. Despite being pursued by the rest of the prisoners, the dynamic duo outruns them and securely shuts the door to the final hallway, leaving the horde behind. Once outside, they find Steve already departing on his personal aircraft, so they quickly board a motorboat and set sail. Mark, along with the police officers in their boats, witnesses Steve's flight. However, he has nothing to fear as the N40 has taken control of Steve's mind. Instead of seeing the mountain in front of him, Steve only sees a stunning view leading to his inevitable crash into it. Jeff and Lizzie witness the explosion and find it amusingly ironic. Jeff comes to the conclusion that there is no magic solution to self-forgiveness. It's a journey that each person must undertake on their own.